Clarence Darrow for the Defense, a Biography, by Irving Stone. Copyright 1941 by Irving Stone. Copyright renewed 1969 by Irving Stone. All rights reserved. Narrated by Barry Burnson.
This book was originally created for audio cassette playback. Any announcements concerning cassettes do not apply to this recording. This version contains markers allowing direct access to major portions of the book.
Annotation. A biography of the American defense lawyer which conveys the intensity of his public and private life and gives the background of some of his most famous cases. 1969. From the book jacket. His private life was considered a scandal. His public life was called a sin. No cause was too unpopular, no mode of behavior too unconventional for Clarence Darrow. As a man, he followed the law of his own needs, flouting his marriage vows with a steady stream of beautiful women, dissipating his magnificent energies through a killing pace of work and pleasure. As a lawyer, he braved the wrath of the entire nation in unforgettable courtroom dramas that pitted one man against the entrenched forces of the establishment. Here is the passionate epic of a man larger than life in his appetites, his ambitions, his genius, by one of the great spellbinding storytellers of our day, Irving Stone. Anarchists, revolutionaries, atheists, murderers. These were some of the politer names with which the press and public branded the men and women whom Clarence Darrow defended. Clarence Darrow had another word for them: innocent. And to defend that belief, he was willing to defy everyone and everything, even a monstrous official conspiracy to put him behind bars in a rigged trial that seemed certain to destroy him. Here is the story of the man who conducted a one-man revolution in our courtrooms, a man whose fantastic genius and magnificent vitality come vividly alive in these pages. Only Clarence Darrow could have lived his life. Only best-selling novelist Irving Stone could have done justice to it. Other books by Irving Stone: The Origin, Adversary in the House, The Agony and the Ecstasy, Dear Theo, an autobiography of Vincent van Gogh, The Greek Treasure, Immortal Wife, Jack London, Sailor on Horseback, Love is Eternal, Passions of the Mind, The President's Lady, Depths of Glory. Dedication. For Gene Stone, my good right arm. Forward. The reader will find 630 source notes at the back of the book. All notes are designated by page reference and subject matter, thus making them readily available to the student without constantly interrupting the reading mood of the more general reader. The main sources of this biography were Clarence Darrow's private correspondence, family documents, manuscripts, legal briefs, notebooks, and unpublished memoirs sold to me by Mrs. Darrow, the back files of court reports, congressional reports, newspapers, magazines, and privately printed pamphlets. The personal contributions of more than 200 of Darrow's lifelong friends, partners, associates, and the untiring efforts of the Darrow family, in particular Mrs. Clarence Ruby Darrow and Paul Darrow, to enrich and authenticate every phase of Clarence Darrow's life. No restrictions were imposed upon me by the Darrows as to what I might write or publish. The names of those who contributed so liberally to this biography are published at the back of the book, but it would be ingratitude indeed if I did not acknowledge at this point that A. Kroc is the godfather of the project, that Justice Francis S. Wilson has worked indefatigably to document it, that Maurice Berkson has read every line of manuscript in an effort to keep it free from legal errors. The entire collection of Clarence Darrow's private papers, as well as all correspondence with the author, is in the possession of Leo M. Cherney of the Research Institute of America, 292 Madison Avenue, New York City, where it may be seen or studied by anyone who is interested. Irving Stone, February 27, 1941. Table of Contents. Prologue. A Lawyer Comes of Age, Side 1. Chapter 1. What Goes into the Making of an American, Side 1. Chapter 2. A Liberal Gets a Liberal Education, Side 2. Chapter 3. Darrow Sprinkles Salt on the Tale of Truth, Side 2. Chapter 4. Who's a Criminal, Side 3. Chapter 5. Let Me Speak for the Children of the Poor, Side 4. Chapter 6. Can a Lawyer Be an Honest Man, Side 5. Chapter 7. Who Will Prosecute the Prosecution, Side 6. Chapter 8, This is War, Side 8. Chapter 9, Prisoner's Dock, Side 9. Chapter 10, In Defense of the Indefensible, Side 10. Chapter 11, Even the Rich Have Rights, Side 11. Chapter 12, Your Old Man's a Monkey, Side 12. Chapter 13, Road to Glory, Side 14. Selected Bibliography, Side 15. Personal contributors to this biography, Side 15. Narrator's Note. The 24 pages of reference notes, found in the print edition, are not included in this recording. Explanatory notes have been retained. End of note. I may hate the sin, but never the sinner. Clarence Darrow. Prologue. A lawyer comes of age. His decision made, he stretched out his fingers before him on the mahogany desk, pushed upward, and rose. It was only a short distance down the hall from the legal department, with the roar of the elevated trains pouring in on a level keel from the open third-story windows, and up 2 flights of stairs to the office of the president. But if he traveled those few steps, they must prove the longest journey he had undertaken in his 37 years. He could cite few sustaining precedents in the casebook of lawyers. He knew he was not the stuff of which martyrs are made. He was not even the possessor of a cause to lend him the courage of fanaticism. Yet, his father had served as the Kinsman, Ohio link of the Underground Railroad, and many a midnight the boy had been awakened to ride to the next village on top of a load of hay that concealed an escaping Negro slave. As he opened the door of his office and stood with the knob in his hand, his head down, his mind recreated the picture and impact of all he had learned about his employers in the 2 years since he had come to work for them as general attorney. If he had been seeking affiliation with bigness and power, not even a position at the right hand of the Roman emperors could have offered him such an opportunity. The railroads and their contributing industries gave employment to 2 million workers. Their capitalization was easily 1/10 of the estimated wealth of the nation. By masterful management, the railroads determined the price manufacturers should receive for their machines and farmers for their fruit, wheat, or hogs, decreed which towns should flourish and which decay, which states should remain agricultural and which become industrial, which companies should be wiped out and which converted into gigantic trusts. He closed the door firmly behind him and strode down the hall, his massive shoulders hunched forward, musing that he would make a mighty poor opponent for an industry that attempted to control the National Congress and the courts, to elect governors and mayors, to buy state legislators and city councilmen. True, he owned the modest home in which he lived, but aside from that he had only a few $100s in the bank. He was a quiet, bookish fellow who loathed discord. What business had he in this mess? Without waiting for an answer to his knock, he thrust open a door and entered a large, plain room. Marvin Hewitt, president of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, was seated behind his desk at the far end, in front of a row of windows that gave a commanding view of the Chicago River and the passenger station on its opposite bank. Though it was a hot July day, Hewitt was dressed in a heavy, dark suit, his iron-gray hair and long beard giving him the appearance of an Old Testament prophet. A man who rarely smiled, Hewitt's eyes twinkled slightly when Darrow came in, coatless, his broad black suspenders holding shapeless blue trousers, the black satin necktie wiggling down his white shirt front like a corkscrew, his big head telescoped into wide shoulders, his fine brown hair falling from a part on the left side over a high, rounded brow. Clarence Darrow admired Marvin Hewitt because he had a sense of justice. Only the year before, he had risked his position and reputation by joining with Darrow in a plea to Governor Altgeld to pardon the 4 anarchists convicted of a conspiracy to throw the fatal Haymarket bomb. On his part, Hewitt was fond of the younger man. He had been responsible for bringing him into the company, after following Governor Altgeld's suggestion to watch the work his protege was doing in the law department of the city of Chicago. Though the job of counsel for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway was several steps up the legal ladder, Darrow had accepted it with misgivings, sensing that the main body of his work would consist in defending the railroad against workmen or passengers who had been injured. By a stroke of good fortune, the claim agent, Ralph Richards, was fair-minded. Together they were able to help a great many people without serious cost to the road. Hewitt liked Darrow's simple manner of handling and settling what other lawyers might have turned into complicated cases. If he cost the company a few extra dollars, he justified the expenditures by earning goodwill and keeping them out of the courts. Hewitt and the other officials of the Chicago and Northwestern knew Clarence Darrow to be an intellectual liberal, sympathetic to the underdog, but he made no attempt to proselytize within the offices of the company, and he did his job better than anyone else they could find. "You look hot, Clarence," ventured Hewitt. "I am, under the collar, even if it isn't buttoned." "Tomorrow's the 4th. You'll be able to cool off." Darrow towered to his full 6 feet. He weighed only 180 pounds, but when he wasn't contracted into a slouch, he seemed enormous. "Nobody's going to be cool in Chicago tomorrow," he said in a tight voice. "I just finished reading the injunction the circuit court served against the strikers this morning. It not only makes it a criminal act for a man to go out on strike, but it becomes a prison offense for one man to suggest to another that he strike. That injunction will save bloodshed and the destruction of property," replied Hewitt soberly. "I thought this was supposed to be a free country. I thought men had a right to stop work when they didn't find conditions satisfactory. If their own elected government tells them it's illegal to strike, that they must work under any terms the employers see fit to grant them or go to jail, then they're no better than slaves. If this is really a democracy we live under, that injunction is illegal." Marvin Hewitt was a self-made man in the most robust American tradition. He had begun as a telegrapher in the Civil War, and by sheer force and conviction had become one of the railway leaders of the country. Though he was autocratic in his methods, his employees respected him for his ability to fill a tough job. "It's perfectly legal, Clarence, under both the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Law." "Now there's a sweet piece of irony," exploded Darrow. "The Interstate Commerce Act was directed against the monopolistic practices of the railroads, and the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed to control corporations like the Pullman Company. You know as well as I that neither act contains any references to labor organizations." "We made our injunction stick in 1877, replied Hewitt doggedly, "when we broke the first big railroad strike." "You had a technical excuse then. The railroads were in receivership. You could claim that put them in the custody of the federal courts." "We have a technical justification this time, too. No body of men can obstruct the United States mails." Darrow shook his head brusquely at Hewitt, as though to say, "You'll have to do better than that." Aloud he commented, "You'd have the devil's own time proving the mails are being obstructed. Only 3 days ago the Chicago superintendent of mails wired Washington that no mails have accumulated here, and that with a few exceptions all regular trains are moving nearly on time, except those carrying Pullmans." "But surely, Clarence," replied Hewitt, "you can see that this strike should never have been called. The railroad men have no grievance against us. They went out only because they were sympathetic to the striking Pullman shop employees." Eugene Debs and the other American Railway Union officials are certainly not going to obey this high-handed injunction and send their men back to work defeated. If they did, they would set a precedent for crushing every strike that arose. Mr. Hewitt, I've learned something about conspiracy since I've been with you. I've watched your General Managers Association control wages on the 24 lines operating out of Chicago. I've watched you depress wages uniformly on all the lines so the men couldn't quit and find better jobs elsewhere. I've watched you use blacklists against good workmen whose only offense was that they thought labor should have better hours and wages. I've watched your agency supply men to member lines on which there were strikes to break those strikes. I've watched you pool your millions to keep your workmen powerless. Why do you think Debs formed the American Railway Union? To fight your conspiracy. Within a few days, Debs and the boys will be in jail with contempt and conspiracy charges against them. Don't you think that in the spirit of fair play, the heads of your General Managers Association should keep them company in jail?" There was silence in the sun-filled room. Darrow's usually soft and merry blue eyes were dark and brooding. "I'm giving up my job here, Mr. Hewitt, to defend Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union." Hewitt regarded Darrow sternly. How to make out this unorthodox behavior? The traditional role of the lawyer was to serve big business against any and all comers, to accomplish its purposes by any and all means. This chap Darrow was a freak, a renegade, but he was a good man, even if he was a misguided sentimentalist. They haven't a chance, Clarence. This injunction is a Gatling gun on paper. Why give up a good position for a hopeless cause? Don Quixote only tilted at windmills. You're going to run into a high-powered locomotive under full steam. Without even the benefit of a horse or a lance, grunted Darrow. I know $7,000 a year isn't a great deal of money, Clarence, but it'll be $10,000 by the end of another year, and $20,000 at the end of 3 or 4. These unions can't pay you anything. When the case is over, you'll be stranded, without clients or a future, and every businessman in Chicago avoiding you as a radical. Stay with us. We can put you on top, make you governor of Illinois or United States senator, get you in the cabinet. Like Attorney General Olney, commented Darrow bitingly. Yes, like Olney. There's fame and fortune for the asking. Then I guess those are not the things I'm asking for, broke in Darrow. I guess I got the wrong background. I believe in the right of people to better themselves, and I'm going to throw in my 10 cents worth to help them. You're determined? I'm determined. When a member of the United States Cabinet, like Olney, who is an old-line railroad lawyer, appoints Edwin Walker, Special Assistant Attorney General at Chicago, knowing that Walker is at the very same time the lawyer for the General Managers Association, and Walker, as a representative of the United States government, persuades 2 federal judges in a Chicago circuit court to enjoin the workers from striking, that's too much of a conspiracy for my weak stomach. I gotta get up and fight. Hewitt leaned across the desk, his hand extended. After we've broken the strike, Clarence, and wiped out the American Railway Union, we want you to come back. Darrow stared at his boss in astonishment. You want me to come back? Well, not full-time, if you don't want to. Say half-time. Handle our cases that don't involve labor or personal injury. Darrow grinned his broad, boyish grin and shook hands with Hewitt. He then went back to his office, stuffed some papers into a briefcase, threw his coat over his arm, and walked out on his job as counsel for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. Chapter 1. What Goes into the Making of an American? A few days before his son had given up his job, Amyras Darrow had decided to spend a week in Kinsman visiting old friends. Clarence had slipped several greenbacks into his father's pocket, and Jessie put up a lunch for her father-in-law for the train. Amyras left early in the morning, riding the streetcar downtown from 4219 Vincennes Avenue. When he found that he had a half hour before train time, he descended a flight of stairs into a basement second-hand bookstore. At 10 o'clock that night, the bell rang at the Darrow home. Clarence opened the door to find his father glaze-eyed, hugging a huge bundle under each arm. Amyras had found so many books for which he had always yearned that he had not emerged from the bookshop until 12 hours later, his railroad and vacation money spent. He had come home to read his precious literary treasures, all desire to visit kinsmen gone. Seeing his father standing before him on the porch, his eyes dreamy and withdrawn and beautiful, the son realized that the older man had always missed his train because he had found something more interesting in a book than would be waiting for him at the end of a journey. Amyras Darrow was the son of a New England farmer who had emigrated to the pioneer country of Ohio around 1830 in an effort to improve himself. He did not better himself materially. No Darrow was ever blessed with the special gift of making or retaining money. But, poor as the Darrows may have been, they gave their children the best available education. Amyras went to a good school in Amboy. In one of his classes, he met Emily Eddy, whose parents had also emigrated from Connecticut, and whose father had likewise served as a station for the Underground Railway. The couple fell in love, married very young, and moved to Meadville, Pennsylvania, where Amyras, athirst for knowledge, attended Allegheny College. Here Clarence's parents acted out their prologue to poverty, living in austere simplicity on whatever coins Amyras could earn in his spare hours. They were happy because they both loved the world of books and ideas and learning. Amyras soon realized that his greatest joy would always be in contemplation, and that he must manage to earn his living from the spoken word and the printed page. Theology being the only apparent field in which one could subsist on the earnings of a scholar, Amyras entered the new Unitarian school in Meadville. He was the first to be graduated. The Unitarian Church was prepared to find him a parish. With a comfortable life assured him, with innumerable hours of the day and night available for his reading and thinking and learning, Amyras abandoned theology because his studies led him to doubt. The end of wisdom is the fear of God. The beginning of wisdom is doubt. He was equipped neither by training nor temperament to do anything else. Already knowing the privations of poverty, the young couple walked fearlessly into a dark, uncharted world rather than be dishonest to their convictions and beliefs. Amyras and Emily Darrow were evidence that everyone is capable of his own peculiar heroism. He may not recognize it under that imposing title, for he is merely doing what his instincts tell him he must do to set his life straight. Yet it is, in fact, so great a heroism that his neighbor, living out his own unrecognizable heroism, is awe-stricken at the other man's courage, and that is what holds the world together. As a result of their decision, Amyras and Emily lived lives of quiet desperation. They returned to Farmdale, just 2 miles from Kinsman, where they found themselves persecuted because they were always the opposition and always the minority, the lone freethinkers against rock-ribbed religionists, the lone Democrats against Ohio's solid Republicans, the lone free traders against the high-tariff tradition, the lone intellectuals in a tiny valley of farmers. Amyras Darrow enjoyed this role of the opposition, not only because it kept his mind alert, kept him studying, gave him serious subjects to think about and discuss, kept him ever searching for fresh knowledge and wisdom, but because it enabled him to be a teacher, to bring ideas from the world beyond the mountains, to plead for open-mindedness, variety in thought, tolerance, the love of the naked truth. There were difficult days, during which the parents of Amyras and Emily must have helped, for the young Darrows earned more children than money from their early efforts. Amyras fumbled dreamily from one job to another. Finding carpentry the least to his disliking, he began building hard wooden furniture for the farmers. That he ultimately trained himself to become a tolerable craftsman is attested by the fact that some of the beds, tables, and chairs he built 70 years ago are still in use around Kinsman, but his heart was never in his work. Clarence said that all his life his father was a visionary and a dreamer. Even when he sorely needed money, he would neglect his work to read some book. Amyras loved knowledge for its own sake. The pure scholar, he had no thought of turning it either to use or profit. Though the family sometimes lacked for the necessities of life, the house was always filled with hundreds upon hundreds of books, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, history, law, metaphysics, literature, strewn about the floor, on the tables, mantelpieces, chairs, underfoot, no matter where one stepped. In all the country round, said Clarence, no man knew so much of books as he, and no man knew less of life. The old parson and the doctor were the only neighbors who seemed able to understand the language he spoke. I remember when his work was done how religiously he went to his little study with his marvelous books. My bedroom opened directly from his study door, and no matter how often I wakened in the night, I could see a streak of lamplight at the bottom of the door, which showed me that he was still dwelling in the fairy lands of which his old volumes told. Often, too, he wrote, sometimes night after night for weeks together, no doubt his hopes and dreams and doubts and loves and fears. To her everlasting glory, Emily Darrow, who had to bear 8 children and raise 7 of them, cook for them, wash their dishes, scrub their clothes and necks and feet, nurse them when they were ill and train them when they were well, who had to see that the thin stream of dollars continued to trickle into the house, and then make each dollar fulfill the obligations of its 2 missing companions, never reproached her husband for his impracticality, or tried to change his nature or way of life. Nor did her privations turn her against books. She continued to read whenever she could find 5 unoccupied minutes, was active in the woman's suffrage movement, campaigned for Democratic candidates in a Republican fortress, and could be counted on to work for the liberal movements in religion, education, and politics. She was an open-faced, wide-eyed, attractively unbeautiful gentlewoman, with a high forehead, robust oval, strong mouth and chin, and hair that she parted in the center to comb tightly downward, concealing all but the lobes of her ears. If she was not demonstrative with the children, it was because demonstrations of affection were thought to be signs of weakness rather than love. The first Darrow to come to America, around 1680, sharing a grant from the King of England for the town of New London, Connecticut, was an undertaker, and Amyras Darrow continued to carry on that trade in conjunction with his small furniture factory in back of the house in Kinsman. The main difference between the original Darrow and Amyras was that the poverty-stricken Amyras had somehow contrived to buy a hearse. When it wasn't being used for funerals, the Darrow hearse was pressed into service as a delivery truck and farm wagon, delivering the beds, tables, and chairs ordered from the carpenter shop, or transporting chickens, pigs, grain. Amyris's fifth child, Clarence, carried on the family tradition. A good part of his life was devoted to burying economic and social corpses that insisted on coming up after every storm. 2. Clarence Seward Darrow was born on April 18, 1857, in a white frame building in Farmdale, an attractive 1.5-story cottage shaded by huge trees. In 1864, when he was 7, and just beginning to understand why so many Trumbull County lads were being brought home for burial in the graveyard behind the church, his family managed to buy a house just a half-mile from the town square of Kinsman, and he called this place home until he was 21 years of age. Kinsman was a valley town planted alongside a small river, on whose banks the original settlers, after they had felled the trees and driven off the wild animals, built white frame houses and planted corn, potatoes, hay. There was little reason for the town to grow big. There was little reason for anyone to grow rich or poor. The settlers remained within the citadel formed by the two flanking ranges. Neither their legs nor their thoughts roamed past the protecting wall of hills, for life was primitively ample in Kinsman. The settlers were content, and their children remained after them content. All except the Darrows, whose father looked to the high hills to the east, and to the high hills to the west, and up and down the narrow country road that led to the outside world. He knew that beyond the high hills was a broad, inviting plain, with opportunity and plenty, with fortune and fame, but as he looked at the hills, he could see no way to pass beyond. It is possible that he could have walked over them, or even around them, if he had been alone, but there was the ever-growing brood that held him in the narrow place. There is an old saying that every pot finds its cover. The nonconformist Darrows, who served as the town agnostics and intellectuals, stumbled onto the one eccentric and nonconformist house in the countryside, an octagonal-shaped structure with a wide wooden pavilion running around 7 of its 8 sides. There was a hill in the backyard, down which Clarence would sled when there was snow on the ground, a creek at the bottom of the hill where he could wade in warm weather, and apple, spruce, and maple trees in the yard to climb. There were chickens, horses, dogs, a cow, also roaming the backyard with the Darrow progeny. For his first pet, Clarence was given a baby chick to raise. One day, he returned home to find his pet being served for supper. The boy fled from the table in tears, for 75 years steadfastly refusing to swallow one morsel of chicken. When he was defending Big Bill Haywood, secretary of the Western Federation of Miners, in Boise, Idaho, Mrs. Wilson, the wife of his assistant counsel, invited him to dinner for the following day. That midnight, when the Wilsons were asleep, there was a knocking on the door. There stood Darrow, without a necktie, his hair falling over one eye. "I forgot to tell you," he murmured apologetically, "I don't eat chicken. When people invite me to dinner, they invariably serve me chicken." "That's just too bad about you," replied Mrs. Wilson. "I've already bought my chickens, and you'll eat what the rest eat." The next evening, Darrow sat resignedly at the Wilson table, watching everyone in turn being helped liberally to roast chicken with giblet stuffing. When it came time for him to be served, Mrs. Wilson emerged triumphantly from the kitchen with a 2-inch sizzling steak. For Clarence, the most fascinating part of Kinsman was the town commons, where he played baseball and stored up the richest memories of his childhood. On Saturday afternoons, the entire population assembled to watch Kinsman play Berg Hill, Warren, or Andover, the games lasting from 1 o'clock until dark, with the girls of the town serving an out-of-doors supper when the contest ended. Clarence was the star first baseman, proudly boasted his younger sister Jenny, and all the girls vied for the honor of making his uniforms. The climax of his youth occurred on the afternoon when, coming to bat in the last half of the 9th inning, their opponents leading them by 1 run, with 2 men out and 2 on base, he hit a home run over the grocery store. Through the years, as he would sit in the bleachers on Saturday afternoons eating peanuts and rooting for the Chicago Cubs, he would remember his sweetest triumph and chuckle. In the town square was located the wagon shop, with its stacks of lumber and piles of long shavings, where he played I Spy. The blacksmith shop, with its white-hot fire, anvil, and hammers, and the mighty-muscled Smith, who was also the town's bellows-lunged lawyer, hammering 4th of July sparks into the air. He knew that the shoe shop was by far the biggest factory in the country, for in busy seasons it employed as many as 4 men. There was the tavern, into which he never dared to venture, even though his father had built most of its furniture. For the owner, it was darkly rumored, kept a barrel of whiskey in a secret corner of his cellar. And then there was the general store, where he wandered among the shelves, marveling that people could think of so many different things to make, wondering for what they could all be used. Lastly, across the river, was the most enchanting place of all, the grist mill with its water wheel, the dam and pond with its frogs, and the mill race where the big wooden gate was lifted, and the water came over the wooden flume to turn the groaning wheel. At the long-anticipated age of 6, he was entered in the one-room district school. Every morning we children were given a dinner pail packed full of pie and cake, and now and then a piece of bread and butter, and sent off to school. Almost as soon as the snow was off the ground in the spring, we boys took off our shoes. No matter how early we left home, it was nearly always past the hour of 9 when we reached the door. For there were birds in the trees and stones in the road, and no child ever knew any pain except his own. There were little fishes in the creek over which we slid in winter and through which we waded in the summertime. Then there were chipmunks on the fences and woodchucks in the fields, and no boy could ever go straight to school or straight back home after the day was done. The procession of barefoot urchins laughed and joked and fought and ran and bragged and gave no thought to study or to books until the bell was rung. Then we watched and waited eagerly for the recess, and after that still more anxiously for the hour of noon, which was always the best time of all the day because of the games. In Clarence's McGuffey readers, every manifestation of virtue earned its immediate and grandiose reward, but not one story told that any profit might come from willfulness or selfishness or greed. By observing the savage conduct of their playmates and the business ethics of their elders, the children rejected their teachers and books. In most of their minds was destroyed the faith in the printed word, the truth to be found between book covers, the value of an education. After passing 6 years in the district school, his first pair of long trousers was given to him, and he was sent up the hill to the public academy. His estimate of his high school years is best delineated by the consternation he caused when he was invited to address the 1918 graduating class of the Nicholas Senn High School in Chicago. The story is told by one of the students. Our glassy-eyed, pompous principal had us 500 graduates thoroughly numbed and awed by the recital of our great responsibilities. Darrow patiently sat it out, playing with a watch chain and looking up at the ceiling as he sprawled in his dinky folding chair. Finally, he was lavishly introduced with the usual long, hot-air harangue of noble phraseology. Darrow ambled over to the big rostrum and leaned against it comfortably in that stooping way he had. He looked like a big, easy-going janitor in the wrong place with all those ramrod stuffed shirts around. He looked us over, turning his head in dead silence, and finally he began to chuckle. "Look, let's you fellows down there relax now. That was as fine a lot of bunk as I ever heard in my life, and I know darned well you youngsters didn't believe a word of it. You're no more fit to go forth and serve than the man in the moon. You're just a bunch of ignorant kids full of the devil, and you've learned practically nothing to show for the 4 years you spent here. You can't fool me, because I once spent 4 years in just such a place." The parents were shocked. The faculty was purple with rage, but naturally we students were ecstatic. It was the only good sense we had heard in months. 3. At home, easygoing Amyras was a tyrant when it came to studies. He was going to train his children to live cultivated and intelligent lives, to fill important places in the world, whether they liked it or not. John Stuart Mill began studying Greek when he was only 3 years old, he drummed into each of his 7 children in turn. Clarence wailed when he had to leave a game of leapfrog or abandon a berrying in the woods to study the lesson in Greek mythology his father had set for him. "Father was pretty strict," said Jenny. "Books and study were all important. Play and fun didn't count. Every night we sat around the kerosene lamp and studied our lessons. When we thought we had learned them, we had to recite them aloud to Father." Everett, the eldest, intervened for Mary to gain her special privileges. Mary, in her turn, interceded for Clarence when he just had to get out to baseball practice. "If I wanted a favor," said Jenny, "Clarence was the first one I turned to." From his father, Clarence learned that tolerance is something more than an opportunistic demand made on other people to persuade them to endure one's views. As an agnostic, Amyras would have no part of the commanding church on the hill, with its square white belfry. Yet every Sunday morning the 7 young Darrows were scrubbed with soap and brushes in iron tubs heated on a wood-burning stove, dressed in their best clothes and shoes, and led up the hill to services, by Mother, while Father retired to the sanctity of his study. Amyras contended that merely because he was unreligious was no justification for forcing his opinions on his defenseless children. After they had participated in the ritual of the church, and been grounded in the history of world religions at home, they would be free to form their own preferences to fit their particular natures. The contest was doubtless not an even one, for the church strove to stifle any joyful religious impulses of the young. The Sabbath, the church, and religion were serious and solemn matters to the band of pilgrims who every Sunday drove up the hill, wrote Clarence. All our neighbors and acquaintances were members of the United Presbyterian Church, and to them their religion seemed a gloomy thing. Their Sabbath began at sundown on Saturday and lasted until Monday morning, and the gloom seemed to grow and deepen on their faces as the light faded into twilight and the darkness of the evening came. I could not understand then, nor do I today, why we were made to go to church. Surely our good parents did not know how we suffered, or they would not have been so cruel or unkind. I could not have sat through the interminable prayers, but for the fact that I learned to find landmarks as the minister, his white face circled with a fringe of white whiskers, went along. At a certain point I knew it was well under way. At another point it was about half done, and when he began asking for guidance for the President of the United States it was 3/4 over, and I felt like a shipwrecked mariner sighting land. When Clarence was 14, his mother died. Emily Eddy Darrow was only 44, but she had already done the work of 2 lifetimes. Despite the brood of children growing up at her feet, she was often lonely, for she had no companions among the orthodox women of the town, and her husband spent his spare hours with his books. No one was able to compute how many thousands of meals she had cooked, beds she had made, floors she had swept, necks, dishes, and shirts she had scrubbed, breads and pies baked, colds treated, fevers fought. Yet as she staggered along without sufficient funds or hours in the day to do her unending job, no one found time or thought to thank her. The husband and children took her for granted. Not until she was gone did they realize how important the mother had been to the home, how empty and forlorn it was without her. Not until he reached his full maturity did her son Clarence understand how kind and strong and good his mother had been, how overworked and harassed and unappreciated. At 16, lanky and gangling, he was sent off to Allegheny College to follow in the footsteps of his father, even though his father's education, to all external appearances, had seemed to do him more harm than good. He lived with the family of Professor Williams, doing chores to earn his board and lodging. His visage was as plain and open as an alarm clock. His eyes were already deep-set. Like his mother and father, he had an enormous forehead, a forward-looking nose, contradictory mouth with its ascetic upper lip and sensual underlip, and a smooth granite-like ball chin with an indentation low down toward the jawbone. It was what lawyers call an affidavit face, one that did not lie, broad-beamed, broad across the heavy eyebrows to the close-fitting ears, broad across the cheekbones, mouth, and chin, not handsome, but big, honest, affable. Young Darrow did not know why he was going to Meadville to college. He had not the faintest notion what he wanted to do. Yet his father, and his older brother Everett, and older sister Mary, who had already graduated from college and were teaching, believed passionately in the magic charm and potency of education. If only Clarence would subject himself to education, all obstacles would be removed, all uncertainty vanish, an open, shining road would be revealed. Nor was this mouthy talk with the 3 older Darrows. They scrimped and saved and denied themselves the ordinary comforts that they might garner the few dollars to send Clarence to college. Here he majored in baseball, added to his dislike of Latin and Greek, stonily refused his father's plea to study Hebrew, got by in geometry, and scratched his first spark of interest in the natural sciences. On Decoration Day he visited home, because he had been invited to speak a piece in the Presbyterian Church, a great honor for the son of the town agnostic. At the end of his freshman year, he returned to Kinsman, torn between apathy and disgust with higher education. And here, in 1873, the railroads made a change in his life, just as they would later in 1894. J. Cook and Company, the banking house that had floated loans for the government during the Civil War, gathered in capital from small investors all over the country to push the building of the Northern Pacific Railroad. The money was used extravagantly, the road built beyond the needs of the times. When the interest payments could not be met on the bonds, J. Cook and Company went into bankruptcy, dragging the rest of the country into a severe depression. If not for the panic of 1873, Darrow might have completed his studies at Allegheny. How that would have altered his course was something he liked to speculate about when he was pondering the imponderables of life. 4. That summer he did his first consistent work, helping in the little furniture factory behind the octagonal-shaped house, though he still refused to go near the shop when his father was measuring a corpse for a coffin. He never became a good carpenter, but his father finally came to trust him with a turning lathe or a paintbrush. What Amyras did not know was that Clarence was refusing to paint the bottom side of the seat of chairs on the grounds that it was a waste of time and paint. To this day, the people of Trumbull County in Ohio turn over Darrow chairs to see whether it was Clarence who wielded the paintbrush. Note, Darrow's failure to paint the bottom of chairs is related by his son Paul, who has chairs with unpainted bottoms to prove his point. End of note. Charles A. Beard relates, once a bright reporter asked Darrow to what he owed his success. Gently protesting against the use of the word success in connection with his life, Darrow replied, "To hard work." When the reporter looked pained at this Chamber of Commerce reply, Darrow explained, "When I was a boy, my father set me to work on a hot summer day hoeing potatoes, and after I had worked hard for a few hours, I ran away from that hard work, went into the practice of law, and have not done any work since." That was truly Darrow-esque. He punctured a conventional sham with a shot. Everyone who knew him knew that he was, in fact, a hard worker all his life, but he simply could not endure the conventional lies of civilization. At the beginning of the fall, to his astonishment, Clarence was offered the job of teacher in the district school at Vernon, 3 miles from Kinsman. He was not the first Darrow to be offered this job. His sister Mary had some time before been given a year's contract by the school board, only to be ousted by indignant parents who were horrified at the thought of the daughter of a free-thinker teaching our youngsters. Mary had taken her contract to a lawyer who had assured her that it was unbreakable, that all she had to do was hold herself in readiness to teach. At the end of the year, Mary had sued and recovered the contractual salary. Opposition to his appointment arose on the ground that he had been subjected to unfortunate influences which he might communicate to the children. But by now a number of years had passed, and because of their exemplary life, folks thereabouts had come to the charitable conclusion that the Darrows were almost as good Christians as they would have been if they had attended church. Clarence had a gentle disposition. He came from a bookish, albeit the wrong kind of books, home, and he had spent a whole year at college. Besides, the wage was so low that no full-grown man would take the job. The fears of the trepidatious proved to be well-founded. He promptly set out to revolutionize district school teaching. Having been slapped by his teacher the first day he had entered school, he abolished corporal punishment. The McGuffey readers were thrown out, as was the system of teaching in terms of moral precepts. He taught from books borrowed from his father's study. Resolving to make his pupils happy instead of wise, he utilized the teaching tools of humor and sympathy, lengthened the noon hour and recesses, joined in their sports, coached their baseball team, tried to make them understand that as their teacher he was a friend and not an enemy. For his efforts, he was paid $30 a month, most of which he turned over to the family, and was received as a guest in the home of a different pupil each school night. I was company. Only the best was set before me. I had pie and cake 3 times a day. Now that he was freed from the discipline and restraint of devoting his days to courses in which he was not interested, now that he had the leisure to think and the right to choose his own fields, the heritage of Emily and Amyras Darrow made itself felt. His brain began to clear from the miasma of adolescence. He found himself leaving home on Monday morning with a package of books under his arm, the novels of Balzac, the poetry of Pushkin or Baudelaire, the political satire of Voltaire, the Odyssey of Homer, or the Republic of Plato, He spent his late afternoons and evenings reading with the eager gusto of the awakening mind that is beginning to question, search, evaluate. Children brought up in book-loving homes rarely get the dream out of their eyes. The exaltation in clear, philosophic thinking, the joy in the pure line of poetry, the delight in a character come to life, a story well told, the music of the lyrical passage swelling across the page in vivid black notes. These add a third dimension of understanding and beauty to the two-dimensional eat-and-workaday world. In his father's home he had been taught, "The truth is your friend. It shall set you free." The favorite form of entertainment in Trumbull County was the Saturday night debate, which was held in the schoolhouse or the largest barn in the district. Everyone from Kinsman came, as did the farmer families for miles around. The subject being debated mattered not at all. The folks, smelling slightly soapy from their Saturday night scrub in the big wooden or iron tubs, came for the sport, to enjoy the clash of wits and personalities, to hear language spoken more literarily than it could be heard anywhere else. Clarence debated nearly every Saturday night. Throughout his school years, it had been the only academic activity he enjoyed wholeheartedly. He was lackadaisical about preparing other lessons, but if he had been given a piece to speak, there was no limit to the number of hours he would spend in writing it down, committing it to memory. His sister Mary had trained him to speak pieces from the time he was 2. The child had taken pleasure in the vocal activity and the limelight provided by an audience. He had spoken naturally, without shyness or hesitation. As he learned to think swiftly on his feet, he earned the reputation of being the best young speaker in these here parts. On the 4th of July, he was again invited to give an oration in Kinsman Square. The Darrows were always anti. As the newest member of the tradition to grow up, Clarence could be relied upon to take the unpopular side of a subject, the side with which almost everyone in the audience disagreed and knew in advance he would be wrong about. He liked the tart sensation of getting to his feet, after his opponent had received an ovation which shook the kerosene lamps hanging on nails in the walls, and facing a solidly hostile pattern of faces, 400 or 500 people whose expressions were compounded of aversion, incredulity, disbelief. There was no exhilaration equal to that of standing alone against the field, beaten before he started, fighting for a hopeless cause. He loved the danger and excitement of flailing against minds that were as sprung and shut as an iron trap over the broken leg of an animal. These good people liked young Clarence, but while he was on the platform fighting against the things they believed in, he became the enemy, the infidel, the apostate, the turncoat. Though he never succeeded in winning a debate, occasionally he had the pleasure of puncturing one of their ideological bubbles with a pinprick of satire or good sense. After the debate had been settled, to the satisfaction of the audience, the benches were cleared away, fiddles and guitars made their appearance, and the square dances and Virginia reels began. Circle 8, break trail and form a line. Corner by the left, partner right. Once and a half, first couple out. Corner 2 and swing. Partner do the same. Do-si-do. Clarence was fond of dancing, but most of all he liked to dance with Jessie Ohl, who was the best dancer in the crowd, an expert at calling the reels. Jessie had a trim figure, amply curved for a 16-year-old girl, and an honest, forthright face with the glowing skin of youth. They made a pleasant couple. 5. After a year of teaching, the 18-year-old boy found his interest turning more and more to the law books in his father's study. Every Monday morning, as I started off to teach my school, I took a law book with me, and, having a good deal of time, improved it fairly well. He was drifting, not knowing that he wanted to become a lawyer. The only thing he knew for sure was that he did not care for physical labor, that, like his father, he wanted to earn his living by the spoken word, the formulated idea, the expressed thought. Since the church was out of the question, there remained only 2 fields, teaching and the law. He sensed that working with young minds in classrooms would not satisfy him long, though it had proved to be a fine life for Everett, who was much the dreamy scholar his father had been. He saw by now that he enjoyed conflict, the clash of mind against mind in the fight for what each conceived to be the right and the truth. His temperament was gratified by the system of logic manifest in both Roman and English law. He was stimulated by the play of human story and drama in the cases he read, and often he was fired by thinking of the cases in which he would battle to help justice triumph. But of what the practice of law actually involved, he knew little. He had opportunity to know but little. The law is a bum profession, as generally practiced, he was to write many years later to a young man who contemplated entering law school. It is utterly devoid of idealism and almost poverty-stricken as to any real ideas. This was knowledge after the fact, which he could not have had before. Like all the other boys, he had seen the country lawyers make a big splash at the 4th of July picnics, and he had been impressed. When Squire Allen got through reading the Declaration of Independence, which we thought he had written because he always read it, he introduced the speaker of the day. This was always some lawyer who came from Warren, the county seat, 20 miles away. I had seen the lawyer's horse and buggy at the hotel in the morning, and I thought how nice they were, and how much money a lawyer must make, and what a great man he was, and how I should like to be a lawyer, and how long it took, and how much brains. The lawyer never seemed to be a bit afraid to stand up on the platform before the audience, and I remember that he wore nice clothes, and his boots looked shiny, as though they had just been greased. He talked very loud and seemed to be mad about something, especially when he spoke of the war and the British, and he waved his hands and arms a great deal. The old farmers clapped and nodded their heads and said he was a mighty smart man and a great man. When Clarence was 20 and had been teaching for 3 years, it was obvious that he could no longer continue at the district school at $30 a month. It was also obvious that he had all the prerequisites of a lawyer. He liked books, he had a natural fluency of speech, was able to think clearly and to the point. He had a pleasant, bland personality which inspired confidence, and the law was surely the open sesame to the world beyond the encircling hills, to politics and a lucrative profession. The family put its loyal heads together in consultation. Everett, who was teaching high school in Chicago, and Mary, who was teaching grade school in Champaign, insisted that he go to the law college at Ann Arbor, Michigan. They would send him enough money for his keep. Once again he spent an undistinguished year in college. Though he enjoyed mildly the companionship of his classmates, he made few friends, and no one influenced him. His grades were mediocre. If his instructors thought about him at all, which is unlikely, they would have had reason to decide that he would become another pettifogging country lawyer, ranting speeches at 4th of July celebrations, so that his farmer constituents would elect him to some minor political office. He was not impressed by his teachers, their method of instruction, or the books in the library to which he was assigned to brief cases. He liked to teach himself, to work alone, to stumble along by himself, to ferret, accept, reject, come to his own conclusions. He did not return to Ann Arbor for the second year of his course. Instead, he found a job in a law office in Youngstown, 20 miles from his home, where he did odd jobs around the office, earned enough to pay for his keep and read the law books, interesting himself in the various subjects as he came upon them or as they arose in practical cases in the office. A few weeks after his 21st birthday, he presented himself to a committee of lawyers who were chosen to examine applicants. They were all good fellows and wanted to help us through. He passed the simple test and was embarked upon a legal career, which was to cover 6 decades and implicate him in nearly every conflict at the core of expanding American life. In the meanwhile, his friendship with Jessie Ohl had deepened. He had liked her since he was 17, and had apparently been attracted by no other girl, though in the innocence of his youth, and the innocence of the age, he seems to have done no experimenting to test his emotion. They were well suited to each other. They were both kindly, easygoing, forthright, and simple in their tastes. There could be little doubt that Jessie would make a good wife and mother. Jessie's family was one of the best in the valley, and owned the grist mill where he had played as a boy. He had a tremendous admiration for Mrs. Ohl, who spent the major portion of her time in Minnesota, where she managed a wheat farm of many hundred acres, took care of all the business details, cooked for a large crew of Swedish and Norwegian hands, and on Sunday mornings preached evangelical sermons to the farmers of the country, a woman of courage, strength, and sound education. When he began riding the 6 miles from Kinsman to Berg Hill, Jessie's mother had commented, "Seems an awful long ways to come a-courting." The legend that Clarence took up with Jessie out of his boundless sympathy, because she was a wallflower with whom no other man would bother, is blasted by the long trip he made to the Ohl farm in Minnesota, just after he turned 21, to spend his summer vacation with her. He had no source of income, But that did not deter young people from marrying in 1880. There was little possibility that a man couldn't find work and earn a living in the uncrowded West. He asked Jessie to marry him, and Jessie agreed most heartily. It was a better match for Clarence than it was for Jessie. The Ole family was solidly entrenched, while he was penniless. And there was always the danger that he would be too much his father's son, that he would spend his life in genteel poverty, his nose in a musty book. 6. They were married in the home of Jessie's brother in Sharon, Pennsylvania, and went directly to Andover, Ohio, a sleepy but prosperous farming center of about 400 people, 10 miles from Kinsman. Here they rented a flat above a shoe store, with a bedroom, parlor, and bath. The bedroom faced the long flight of stairs and was turned into an office, Jessie spending part of her wedding money to buy law books with which to impress the potential clients. When the first couple of months passed, and the young lawyer took in less than the $30 wage he had earned as a schoolteacher, Jessie decided they would have to retrench. The Darrows took in a boarder. James Roberts was a young lawyer who, under the terms of the agreement, became not only Clarence's table companion, but his law partner as well. The records fail to reveal where Roberts slept, since Jessie had already converted the parlor into their bedroom, but the question is an academic one at best, for within a few weeks young Roberts acquired some poker debts and absconded with the law books Jessie had bought her husband. Very much of an unawakened country boy, Clarence had been unimpressed by the world beyond the Kinsman Hills when he had gone to Ann Arbor, and he had rejected the idea of beginning his practice of law in Youngstown, where he had worked and passed the bar and acquired a few friends, because it was a metropolis of 20,000 people. Its bigness frightened him. In spite of his father's rigorous insistence upon study, he was sketchily educated, had only a meager training in the law, and was not overly industrious or ambitious. Nor could anything happen in Andover to bring him to maturity, for the most exciting events in the passing days were the falling down of a horse in Main Street, or the lowering of a safe from a second story. His business consisted of drawing up papers for horse trades, for which he would receive 50 cents from each participant, or suing one farmer in the name of another for fraudulent representation over the matter of livestock or seed, in which instances there might be as much as $2. For the satisfactory settlement of a boundary dispute, he felt entitled to charge $3. There was now and then an action in replevin, in which he went into court to secure the return of goods or chattels for his client, and for trying the case he received $5. Occasionally he defended a farmer accused of selling hard cider, in return for which he got more cider than cash. After a year of practice, he found that he was taking in as much as $50 and $60 a month, which provided a modest living, and even enabled the frugal Jessie to save a few pennies. The climax of his practice was reached on the night he dashed into the kitchen, slapped his knee excitedly, and exclaimed to his wife, "I made $20 today." The Darrows spent a pleasant 3 years in Andover. Jessie was an enthusiastic cook and a spotless housekeeper. In addition, she washed and ironed Clarence's linen, pressed his suits so that he would look well-groomed, and made friends with the townspeople and farmers so they would bring her husband business. The young couple loved each other, they got along well, and Jessie never interfered in Clarence's way of life. On December 10th, 1883, a son was born to them named Paul. This event stirred Clarence sufficiently to get him to move to Ashtabula, a town of 5,000 people, the largest in the surrounding country. He was no stranger in this village of modest cottages on tree-lined streets. The people remembered him from his baseball and debating days. Besides, he had journeyed here several times to try cases for Andover folk and had come off pretty well. He was now approaching 26, had achieved his full growth, and was a responsible family man. He had a fund of what the farmers called horse sense. He grasped situations quickly, thought through them logically in terms of right and justice rather than codified law, and could always be relied upon to be honest. In discussing cases, he talked the simplest English, never attempting to hide his ignorance behind a barrage of legal phraseology. He rarely took a case in which he did not believe his client to be right, and having thus convinced himself, fought with an emotional intensity that transcended the small fees or properties involved. When Farmer Jones hired Darrow to regain title to a cow from Farmer Brown, and succeeded in regaining the cow, Farmer Brown might cuss Darrow for a week of Sundays, But when next he had a suit over the title to a horse or a harness, he did not go back to the lawyer who had lost his cow for him. He went instead to young Darrow. A lawsuit then, wrote Darrow, before a justice of the peace, was filled with color and life and wits. Everyone for miles around had heard of the case and taken sides between the contending parties or their lawyers. Neighborhoods, churches, lodges, and entire communities were divided as if in war. Often the cases were tried in town halls, and audiences assembled from far and near. An old-time lawsuit was like a great tournament, as described by Walter Scott. The combatants on both sides were seeking the weakest spot in the enemy's armor and doing their utmost to unhorse him or draw blood. It was Darrow's technique to unhorse his adversaries rather than to shout them down. When the opposing attorney tore off reams of bombast, he made the rhetoric sound silly by stating quietly and simply the point at issue. When they wandered far afield, he poked gentle fun at their meanderings. When they took shelter in abstruse technicalities, he appealed to the common sense of the judge and jurors. All his life he remained a country boy at heart. His understanding of the farmer's psychology served him well, as is illustrated in his appeal to the jury in a famous arson-perjury case a number of years later. "You folks think we city people are all crooked, and maybe we are, but we city people think you farmers are all crooked. There isn't a one of you I'd trust in a horse trade, because you'd be sure to skin me. But when it comes to having sympathy with a person in trouble, I'd sooner trust you folks than city folk, because you come to know people better and get to be closer friends. Here's a case where a girl lied to save a friend. I don't doubt but that all of you have done that in the past, or would do it if you had a friend in trouble. Of course, if you wouldn't tell a lie to save a friend in trouble, there's only one thing for you to do, and that's to vote for conviction. But if any of you have ever told a lie to save a friend, I don't see how you can vote to send this girl to the penitentiary." The girl was acquitted. Darrow had been in Ashtabula only a short time, when he was taken into the office of Judge Sherman, with whose young sons he had become friends. With the judge's backing, Darrow ran for the office of city solicitor. Remembering the shouting and arm-waving of the 4th of July orators, Darrow took the opposite tack, making only a few quiet talks. He was elected hands down. The salary was $75 a month, in addition to which he could take his own cases, which now became fairly numerous because clients liked the idea of having the city attorney handle their business. He remained in Ashtabula for 4 years. He made a comfortable living, was well-liked, and was on his way to becoming one of the leading lawyers of the county. During the evenings he played poker with his cronies, the game he loved best next to baseball. Over a few bottles of beer or highballs, the men would tell tall tales, play for low stakes and high excitement. For the first time, Darrow had fun. He did only a little reading. His love of books and knowledge for its own sake lay dormant. For 200 years no Darrow had distinguished himself, and it did not appear that Clarence would ruffle the family tradition. He had already passed 30 before the role of country lawyer played itself out. Having saved $500, he and Jessie decided to buy a home. They found a suitable one for sale for $3,500. Darrow drew up a deed with the owner, which provided for the payment of $500 cash and the balance in monthly payments. The next day the owner turned up without his wife's signature on the deed, saying that she refused to sign, the implication being that she did not think young Darrow could meet the monthly payments. "All right," fumed Darrow, "I don't want your house because I'm moving away from here." The following afternoon he met a woman of whom he was not specially fond. "And how is our prominent lawyer today?" asked the woman. "Oh, fine, fine," replied Darrow. "I just got a big case." "How nice. Here in Ashtabula?" "No," stuttered Darrow. In Chicago." "That's just lovely. When are you going to try it?" "Why, as a matter of fact, tomorrow." He took the early morning train into Chicago. "The next day I had to go to Chicago, because if the woman saw me on the streets of Ashtabula, she would have told the whole town I was a liar, which I was." Having nothing better to do, he went to see his brother Everett. Everett had been working on his younger brother, whom he loved and admired, to move to Chicago. "You have too big a brain for a small town," he told Clarence. You belong in a big city where important things are happening and where you can play your part. But it's an awful big jump, Everett, and I have only $500 in the bank. I don't know a soul here. I'd have to start from scratch again. It won't take you long to catch on. Besides, I have a steady job, and I can lend you whatever money you need until you become established. You owe it to yourself, Clarence. Darrow maintained that if the deed he had drawn had been signed, he would have spent the rest of his life in Ashtabula, worrying about meeting the overdue payments. But there are indications that he was tiring of the pleasures of small-town camaraderie and of small-town life, where, he wrote, Protestant